All right. Okay. I think. Well, we are 50 seconds in. I hope it's still record. There we go. Now look, I want to go over something. This is a presentation I made together with my colleague Moses Mushiri Mwangi, and we were talking about why currency politics should matter for Kenyans. So I needed to go over this again because I need to do some review and keep some of this content fresh in my mind a little bit. So you can find this presentation at the Institute of Economic Affairs website and on YouTube. If you just Google or YouTube or search Emmanuel Wa-Kyendo, Moses Mushiri Mwangi, why currency politics should matter for Kenyans, and you will find it. Now, I already went over what currency is and why it's where it comes from. So we want to look at the nexus of international trade and investment and the exchange rate and what determines the movement in relative value of currency. So now monetary policy. Monetary policy is basically, you can categorize economic policy in so many different ways, right? One of the ways is in terms of what is happening with money. So fiscal policy is directly spending money. That's the one kind in this categorization. And monetary policy. So a government is either carrying out fiscal policy or monetary policy. So now the exchange rate. So what does it even mean to have a floating or a fixed exchange rate? The exchange rate. The exchange rate is the rate at which you can buy trade between currencies, right? If a currency is said to be weakening over time, it can buy less and less of another currency. So if the shilling is weakening against the dollar, it can buy less dollars, right? So the appreciation or depreciation of currency is dependent on market factors. Basically, what that means is whether a currency is strong or weak is really about whether it's determined by the market. Do people want Kenyan shillings? So why would anyone want Kenyan shillings? They would want Kenyan shillings. Maybe they want to buy tea, Kenyan flowers. So they sell dollars and buy shillings, right? So they can go and buy this tea or these flowers. If they don't want Kenya tea or flowers, then that's one way. And if they don't want anything from Kenya, any Kenyan goods, then the Kenyan currency wouldn't be in demand. So essentially, the value of currency is also determined by inflation, right? If a country is experiencing high inflation, domestically, well, this is actually eating into the value of the currency. There is something here called we can distinguish between floating and fixed exchange rates. Now, floating exchange rate means that no one interferes with the exchange rate, right? No one, I mean the government specifically, the government does not try to place the currency at its specific spot for whatever reason. This is usually the one economic orthodoxy holds it that you should let the currency float. Don't interfere with it, right? Don't touch it. Don't move it one way or another. So now, what about depreciation? Right? Why else? What are other reasons that a currency actually loses value? So I mentioned that we're talking about fundamentals. What's going on in the economy? Let me break that down a bit more slowly too. You could have this identity in mind called there's a GDP identity, right? Basically says that the GDP, the output of a nation, can be calculated by consumption, adding together consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net imports less exports, right? What do you have? Your net imports, right? So if now, how could these elements help us at least try to break down what it means when people say that it's the fundamentals that cause the currency to shift? Let's say if you are exporting much more than you're importing, right? If you're exporting a lot, so your currency is in high demand, well, over time the market will correct because your goods become too expensive for foreigners who are demanding the shilling. Then all things equal, demand let's say if someone there was a sudden a surprise Valentine's week, and then all of Europe just wanted all these Kenyan flowers because this is one of the places that they get their flowers from. Well, all of a sudden you would see that's dry, and let's say they wanted so many flowers and we weren't importing anything, we were just exporting flowers, right? The Kenyan shilling would appreciate up to a point where the Europeans would say, okay, we're not going to pay any more for this. Then the Kenyan shilling will start to depreciate. So that's a very simple way to think about what happens when the trade balance changes, what happens to the currency. What does this mean? This, or to the average person, if the Kenyan shilling is really strong, you can buy stuff from foreign markets for much cheaper. So now let's say that as we're exporting flowers, Kenyan shilling is in such high demand, it starts growing strong, that now you want to buy stuff from around the world because all of a sudden, your currency is really strong, right? So for the consumer, the Kenyan consumer, a strong currency is a good thing. But for the producer, the exporter, right? The Kenyan exporter, a strong currency is actually, like a strengthening currency, is actually detrimental to their activities, right? If it's strengthening beyond the equilibrium, now you can't export as much. So, what else affects the currency? Government expenditure. If a government is very, very indebted, right? How does this affect the currency? Well, now, high indebtedness. Okay, even I need to review my notes for this one. So, first, let's talk about how it affects investors, those who are observing a government just borrow a lot. Their confidence about the currency, about the government's ability to pay starts to decrease, right? So how do foreigners respond? Well, they're going to say, we don't want to buy your debt anymore. We don't want to invest in your debt. And everything that foreigners, if indebtedness is severe enough that foreigners decide that they don't want anything to do with any investment in Kenyan shillings and they exit, this will cause the currency to weaken, right? Another fear might be that if the government is really indebted, the investors might say, okay, you're going to print money now in order to pay this debt. So they're afraid of what? Inflation. Inflation could eat into their profits. It could eat into it could also drive price, because it represents that rising prices. It could also make it more expensive to maybe buy purchasing inputs, right? Essentially, inflation caused by this high, the fear of inflation is a fear of a loss of competitiveness. So they're saying, if I keep pumping money to run my Kenyan factory, I'm going to start, now I'm losing money because of what the government is doing with inflation. If it's printing money or borrowing more. So investors will say, I don't want to put any more money into this factory. Maybe I don't even want to keep it running. I want to shut it down so people lose jobs. So that's why a government indebt, that's just one simple facet of how government indebtedness becomes an issue for the currency. And then the next thing, investment. Let's take the United States, for example. Without getting too deep into the weeds, right? A stable political system, a government that does not interfere in monetary policy, consistent monetary policy, transparency in government, good governance, all these things contribute to the demand for US dollars, in addition to other factors, that we won't cover right away. So foreigners will look at the US government and say, okay, the US economy is also highly productive. So that means that the government will continue to be able to raise taxes from that very productive economy. So that means that if the government borrows, they can repay their debt. So, hey, let me park some of my money in American treasuries, right? When the American government says, hey, they want to raise money, they want to sell bonds, people will go ahead and buy them because they have faith in the US government's ability to repay, right? So investments then can drive up the strength of the currency because everyone wants a piece of the US dollar. So if the same thing was to happen to the shilling would strengthen. So it would by strengthening, we've covered what happens to the demand side and the supply side, to those who are importing and those who are exporting, and how they are affected by a strong or weak currency. And the important thing there is, strong doesn't mean that it's just all the way, all around good. It depends on which side you fall. Now, so another way that the currency can depreciate is if your monetary policy, you raise interest rates lower interest rates, or any actions that increase the supply of money. That's what quantitative easing is about. If you increase the money supply, then just because money behaves just like any other good, its value falls, and so the exchange rate falls. Low interest rates also translate into cheaper, weaker currency. Why? Interest rate, as we covered before, is the price that someone is willing is going to charge you in order to not consume his money right now, but to lend it to you. Slowing exports, we've covered that, right? The way that if we're not exporting as much anymore, then demand for the currency weakens. Now, what about managed or fixed exchange rate regimes? Let's see. Depending on how many minutes we've been going, perhaps that is a safe place to stop, and we can cut this into the